Roll 303 here. Hope everybody's having a good day. This is a little video that I've put together about the M1918 Mark 1 trench knife. So these knives are pretty iconic, really. First World War fighting knives. They came about as America entered the war and came over. They'd got an awful lot of data, for want of a better word, and information that they gathered from the British and the French over the previous 3-4 years that they'd already been fighting. And they decided that, given the French and the British experience, they were going to create a fighting knife specifically for the American Expeditionary Force. And so a bunch of officers got together and looked at the requirements of what they actually wanted in this kind of fighting knife. So there were a few criteria that they looked at. There was the ability to perform other tasks whilst holding the knife. So this is where these knuckles come in. Now, you look at the knuckles and straight away you think that's for whacking people with, that's for breaking noses and crushing skulls. Well, yeah, it could well be, but one of the other functions of the knuckles was to actually allow ease of grip on the knife and keep it securely in your hand. And as I said, to be able to perform other tasks. I'm not quite sure what that looks like, but you know, that's what they said. Whilst holding the knife, quickness of employment in action was another specific outcome that they were looking for, and really that's about the sheath, I guess, and being able to draw that quite quickly. Don't have the sheath with this knife to be able to show you, unfortunately. It is on its own. Sheaths are quite rare, but I've always thought with that one, you know, quickness of employment, ease of employment, the knuckles kind of get in the way, really, because with a regular knife, you just wrap your fingers around the handle and pull it out of the scabbard. With this thing, you've actually got to find a grip, as it was. So I'm not quite sure where that fits. Ease of security of carrying, that one is fairly evident. If you're in a trench hand-to-hand fight, you get knocked over, you're likely to lose your knife. You're less likely if your knife is secured to you in some way, and being secured via this knuckle guard is a kind of a good way of your knife not just kind of slipping out your grasp, I guess. And I think really that was kind of like the main sort of reasons that they wanted to employ something other than the existing fighting knives, which at this stage of the war were mainly ersatz knives, cut down bayonets, you know, knives that soldiers had privately purchased. There were a few specific fighting knives, trench knives in existence at this time. You got things like the French nail, which is basically just a barbed wire post which has been hammered into the shape of a nail with a kind of a knuckle guard. Really basic, rudimentary sort of fighting weapon, really, almost harking back to the kind of Middle Ages, really. I mean, a lot of these weapons were very much harking back to the hand-to-hand fighting of a bygone era before the invention of gunpowder and firearms. I mean, such was, as I said, the brutality of the trench warfare. Got to remember, it wasn't all about going over the top and getting mowed down by machine guns. That, you know, between the huge battles, the battles like Loos and the Somme, and you know, some of those other iconic big battles, there were periods where it was relatively quiet on the trenches, and in order to carry on the momentum of the war as it was, the generals basically, and the higher echelons of both armies ordered trench raids to happen, and these trench raids usually happened at night, usually involved a small cadre of soldiers, although it could be a larger one. There were bigger trench raids that would jump into the German trenches, sneak across no man's land, jump into the German trenches, and either try and cause as much damage as possible, or get a prisoner and take them back to their lines. And when they did that kind of work, this wasn't a stand-up fight with firearms. I mean, you know, it was pistols, and you know, and hand-to-hand melee weapons. So things like the fighting knife and other weapons such as clubs. They, you know, I mean, like I said, these put together sort of homemade maces, anything you can think of, really. There was even a mace that was designed where you took the innards out of a Mills bomb, hand grenade and basically welded the fragmentation cover, the outer shell, onto the end of a stick and used it as a club. So there were all sorts of bits and bobs going on. And this knife, getting back to the M1918, this knife was specifically designed with those tasks in mind, with things like trench raids and hand-to-hand fighting. You fire your rifle empty in battle, and then you know, what have you got? You might have a pistol, you fire that empty. What you got then? Well, you go to the knife if that's what you've got left. And this is the knife that the American powers that be considered to be the answer to those applications, really. So the initial order was for a lot of these things, a lot. So originally, the original order was for 1,233,000 of these knives. That figure again, 1,233,000. That is one hell of a lot of 1918 trench knives. One hell of a lot. Well, guess what? That figure was never reached. In fact, the amount that was reached of these knives in production was 119,400. So a tiny fraction, really, of the original order. And the reason why there's so few when they originally wanted so many was because the war ended. So the order for these knives is going in probably around mid 1918. So they're just tooling up production for these things in the States, and we're in a situation really where there's a huge order. I'm sure that, you know, there's some companies here that are standing to make an awful lot of money. Massive amount of knives that have been ordered. Over a million, nearly 1.25 million of these things. So the war effectively came to a close. It ended, obviously, in November 1918, and none of the American-made knives, actually, I don't believe they were even in France. They certainly weren't in the trenches. They certainly didn't get into combat because the war ended. So there was no kind of need for them. Everything stopped. So the M1918, whilst looking the part and being specifically designed for use in the trenches in a certain way, was never actually used. Or was it? Well, the answer to that is yes, it was, but not specifically the American-made ones. So in order to speed up production, the Americans actually put a contract out to a French cutlery company called Arlion. And Arlion made a certain number of these knives. And the idea was that if Arlion made these knives in France, they could get them into the Allies' hands, get them into American hands, and they'd at least have a start. And meanwhile, you know, the other knives that were being built stateside had got time to come over. So that was the theory, and that's what happened. So the Arlion knives actually got into combat. They were in France at the time, and they got into combat. So the Arlion knives, if you get an Arlion knife, and I'll tell you what to look for in a minute so that you know, it's possible. I mean, I'm not going to say likely, because who knows, you know, 103 years after the fact, who knows? But your Arlion knives are the ones that effectively got into general use, or at least a number of them did. So they're the knives to look out for in terms of that. The other knives didn't actually see combat use in World War One. The footnote to that is the American-made knives did see combat in World War II. They were carried by a lot of paratroopers and special forces, rangers, people like that. Used these knives to great effect during World War II. What they actually did in World War II, though, was these knives are very cumbersome and awkward to carry in a sheath because of this big handguard here that you can see. So what they did was they ground off the edges here. They ground off either side, so that will then sit flush against your waist or your belt, whatever it is you're carrying it on. So you do come across these knives that have actually been modified and sort of modded out to an individual soldier's specifications, and they did this in the field. This wasn't a sort of a particularly big thing, really. It was just soldiers tricking them out in the way that they needed them for combat. You'll even see some of them with the knuckles ground off, so this is then just a straight blade, because obviously some of them didn't like the idea of being able to have to fumble around when they needed to get to that knife quickly for whatever reason, so they got rid of that. So yeah, these knives are iconic to World War One, but the O'Lion knives are the ones that kind of made it into the trenches. The American-made ones, not so much. In fact, not at all, as far as we know. So extensive use in both World Wars. Sorry, the Second World War. The American ones were used, as I said, by the kind of more elite units, and you will see those floating around with the modifications that I've described. So let's take a look at this O'Lion M1918 Mark 1 trench knife. So the basic difference with the O'Lion to the American version is that the O'Lion knives are pretty roughly made. They're functional, they work well, they're certainly very durable, but they're made differently to different specification. Well, the specifications are the same, but I think the quality control is probably very different. So these knives are made as a functional knife. They are often stamped really roughly, so you see their US 1918. The American made ones, they usually carry a really clear stamp, a really clear and distinctive stamp, and then underneath that they've often got the name of the manufacturer, which in most cases is LFC. So that stamp is often quite either obscured, partly stamped. Sometimes it looks all right, but more often than not it's not. Also, the O'Lion knives, a certain amount of them carry these grooves here, which the other ones don't. So that's kind of unique to the O'Lion knives, these grooves here. Not all of them carried those grooves, but many did. And then, of course, not to forget the pommel head crusher, as they called it there, which was used for downward action. So obviously, if you're carrying a knife thus, you can then use that as a kind of striking implement there. So just looking at it, they are the basic features of this particular fighting knife. We've got the knuckles here, we've got a pommel here for downward motion. You've got a very, very sharp double-edged blade here. Now, these blades were prone to breaking. They are quite delicate, actually. It's ironic because it's got the most robust handle in the world and then quite a delicate blade. Now, this blade should have been I think it was 6.75 inches long, but often that blade, the tip of that blade snapped off. They lost it. It got, just even in general use, opening things like rations and things like that, the blade tip could snap off, and that's exactly what's happened with this example. This example is about 1 centimetre shorter than it should be, because the tip of the blade has gone and it's been reground. So I think it still looks good. It's still a good surviving example, but the blade is very slightly shorter than it should be due to that problem that they most often had. So how did I come across this particular example, this O'Lion example? Well, very, very occasionally you will see some usually fairly prestigious collector shops and antique shops that deal specifically in high-end sort of military, will occasionally have these come along. They often come from collections of people that have had them for many years. There's not too much of a trade in these. Most people, if they've got one, they hold on to it because they are comparatively rare, particularly in England. These are American knives. The majority of them went back to America and were either disposed of or put into storage after the war. Used in World War II, and then obviously whatever happened to them afterwards, whether the soldiers took them or they went back into the army inventory, I'm not sure, but they're fairly rare to find today, but not impossible. You can find them. Now the other thing is, if you want one of these knives, you've got to really, really want it, because they come at a huge cost. They are not cheap. They are not cheap knives to own, and for that reason you really need to do your homework when you're buying these knives, because there are an awful lot of fakes around. So just a few features again of this particular knife. As I said, you've got the old iron stamp here. Now the old iron stamp, this is quite a pitted blade, I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's see if we can get that. The old iron stamp there is a partial stamp. You can see the back of the lion there, that's the lion's sort of back, and then he's lying down, and then his head is kind of not particularly well stamped there, and it's got some pits on it, but that's his head there looking forward. And then obviously under the lion you've got a lion, the stamp itself, and the stamp is just very slightly offset. So quality production in these knives is not at a premium. As I said, they are functional pieces of kit. Often people look at the old iron ones and think, oh yeah, it's got to be a copy because, you know, it looks crap. Well, you know, that's how the old iron knives looked. They were knocking these things out like wano. They wanted to get them into the trenches. They wanted to get them into soldiers' hands. So having a pretty stamp on them was not a top priority, really. It was about, you know, does this weapon work? Is it suitable? Is it robust enough? Yes, all boxes ticked. Bang them out. So the way they stamped the actual knives was not of great concern to the French manufacturers, but you can still see distinctively on this knife US 1918, not the best stamp in the world, but it's there. The other thing about this knife is that the blade is actually really heavily pitted. As you can see, there is some quite nasty pitting on this blade, but the blade is still stable, and it's also extremely sharp. And the reason that it's extremely sharp is because I've sharpened it. Now, there I hear a lot of purists gasp and say, what the hell? Well, what I need to tell you is that this knife, when I got hold of it, was in a state. It was in an absolute mess. It was covered in rust. It was very pitted. It wasn't looking particularly good. And I had to make a decision as to whether I was going to keep it as it was, or if I was going to actually turn it into something nice and a good example. And I thought, looking at it, really, when I actually got it in my hand, I thought it's pretty far gone, this knife. You know, what am I going to do with it? So I decided that I was actually going to try and do my best to save the blade. Maybe save's a bit of an overdramatic word, but I certainly wanted to do some work on the blade. It really did not look in a good state. It had been badly ground on the tip, and also it had been quite badly sharpened as well. And when you sharpen a knife badly, what you end up getting is a bevel that sort of comes inwards here, from the sort of the hilt area of the end of the blade here, as it joins the handle, as it joins the pommel. You get this kind of concave on both sides, and I thought personally it looked unsightly. It really did. So I had to do a little bit of work on I suppose regrinding the blade. I should have when I say that, really, because a lot of people would say a knife of this value and this age and this rarity, why are you messing around? Why are you doing that? Keep it as it is. Well, you know, at the end of the day, I spent my money on this knife. It's my possession, and I wanted it to look good. I wanted a good representative example of this type of knife, and the blade had been butchered. So that's the reason that it is messed with. And if ever I got to the point where this knife changed hands, which it's not likely to because it's a central part of my collection, this knife would be sold with that in mind. I would tell any collector that is the situation with this knife, that it has been reground in terms of the blade. Also, because the blade was slightly shorter than it should have been, it did look just a bit odd. So I wanted to do something with it to really get it looking like a good example, and that is what I've done. Also, because the blade was so pitted, I thought it might be an idea just to put a little bit of coral blue on the blade in order to, I suppose, disguise those pits. You can see that this side of the blade is really heavily pitted. Now, a lot of people would say that's not too bad. Well, maybe it's not too bad, really. I mean, the thing's 103 years old, Jesus Christ. But that being said, I wanted to try and make it look presentable in my collection. So a little bit of cold blue on either side. It hasn't turned it black. That wasn't my intention. I didn't want it to turn black. But what I did want to do was disguise those pits just a little bit for when it's on display, and it's worked quite well. It has worked quite well. So what else to tell you about these knives? Well, I can only imagine that if I was jumping into a trench and I was desperately fighting for my life, that this knife would probably be something that would be very well valued. You could even use this knife in your non-dominant hand in order to fight whilst you were, doing something else with your right hand, pistol in your right, maybe this knife in your left, who knows. But one thing for sure is it would be a pretty good fighting weapon. Practical application, things like opening rations and cutting stuff, probably less so because of that delicate blade tip, but hey ho, I'm sure it was used for many things. This one definitely was, because it's very well used. Whether or not that was in use in service or whether it was in civilian use, it's obviously been in civilian hands for an awfully long time, a great deal longer than the time it's spent in the military. And I would imagine it's been used by civilians for whatever they've used it for, as a practical tool or otherwise. So yeah, this knife has seen a great deal of use. Now, in terms of anything else, this knife is a big part of my World War One collection of militaria. I'm a serious collector of World War One militaria. I try and collect high-end examples and good examples of what was used, whether it's firearms, whether it's edged weapons, helmets, or whatever. And this will be remaining in my collection in an appropriate way, whether that's locked up in a safe or whether it's on display for short periods of time. If you're dealing or collecting these sorts of things, you want to make sure that they are secure, because there will always be people out there that want to nick them from you. So yeah, you've got to keep these things really secure, and away from anybody that might want to take them from you. So aside from that, what else can I tell you? I would love to find a scabbard for this knife. The Olion knives had a different scabbard to the American-made ones. The Olion ones had a steel scabbard, I think it was, or an iron scabbard, and they are really rare. They had two prongs on the back of the scabbard to attach them to a belt, and that was a real weak point in the design. Those prongs were incredibly flimsy and broke really easily. So to find a scabbard is one thing, but to find a scabbard with those prongs still on it is nearly impossible. And if you do, then you may end up paying more for the scabbard than you would for the actual knife. They are that rare. So yeah, I'd like to get a scabbard for this knife. Is it essential? Not really, not essential. The knife is good as it is. Really, it's the central thing. So a very striking knife, and I think a very good and almost poignant example of a piece of World War One history that brings home to you just the brutality and the personal nature of that conflict. Something that I don't think any generation thereafter, probably with the notable exception of the World War II generation, really has any notion of what that warfare in that context was like. So yeah, very specific to that war, and it's a knife that I'm proud to own, if that can be said, in any sort of, I don't know, meaningful way. It's quite, I think, quite a responsibility to have something this rare. You need to look after it and ensure that it's passed down. So that's about as much as I can tell you about the M1918 Mark 1. If you've got any questions, please let me know in the comments. It's certainly an interesting piece of history. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe please, and also consider donating via Patreon if that's your thing. Let me know and I'll give you the details of how to do that. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening. See you soon.